about 50 years ago. If you were an East German looking to buy a car, chances are you were given one of these, the Trabant. Besides being the butt end of every joke, the Trabant was notorious for being one of the last cars ever produced with a two-stroke engine. And honestly, how could you blame them? These things can be remarkably simple. In fact, so simple that today, I'm going to make one of my own. Because if they were able to do it, then so can I. So the reason that I'm able to make this video is because I got one of these, a milling machine. This one says that it's a Craft X, though I'm sure it goes by a few other names. Change speeds only with the machine stooped. Nice. Now, a milling machine is kind of like a much bigger drill press, except that it has these hand wheels which allow you to cut sideways, with precision down to 1/1000th of an inch. But even with all of these different tools that came with the machine, I'm still pretty new to this stuff. I think that most people would probably do the sensible thing and start with a small project. Something like a hammer, or maybe one of those cube things that everybody had to make in high school. But I think I'm just gonna jump right in and figure it out as I go. Now I first want to start by making the engine block, which begins with me turning this pipe down in the lathe. Next, I headed over to the mill to face both ends. Now, ideally, I would have just done this in the lathe, but given how large and heavy this pipe is, that's gonna be so bad. It's probably a better idea to do it in something that will actually hold it. Never mind, this sucks. And I thought I could speed this up a little bit by replacing the vise that I was using with this smaller one, which gives me enough room to stand the pipe upright. Bruh. Eventually, once I was finished with that, then there was just a couple more steps before I could weld these blocks to the inside of the pipe. Which I think would have been a lot easier if A, my good welding mask was actually working, and B, if the only other welding mask I had was also working properly. Can you tell that I did this completely blind? I guess it's kind of my fault because I totally forgot these things even use batteries.
Oh, maybe that's why I can't see.
Nevertheless, after a little bit of drilling and milling, the bottom half of the block is done. Well, almost. The next step would be to square up the faces, but I can only do that once I've got the top side. Because the top side is practically identical to the bottom one, it was pretty much just a matter of repeating everything you saw me do earlier, but with a few added steps this time. So the next step is to add some holes for the bearings, which is a little bit tricky, because not only do the holes need to be exactly in the middle of the block, more importantly, all three of them need to be exactly concentric with one another. And this wouldn't really be a big deal if I could just do it all in one pass. But even if I did have a long enough boring bar, there's just not enough room on the mill for that to happen. But I think that I've got an idea. So I first started by drilling this hole, and then after dropping the drill bit down the same hole I just made,
That is f***ing stuck.
I could then start boring the holes. Which was a little bit nerve-wracking, because any big mistakes would result in scrapping the entire thing, along with all the time that I just spent making it. But thankfully, I was able to get through the first side without much trouble. So then I flipped it around and started again. And to make sure that this last hole is actually going to line up, I use this coaxial indicator to find the center of the holes that I just made. So, in theory, all three holes should now be on the exact same axis. At least I really hope so. Anyways, after adding the last finishing touches, now it's time to move on. Now, even though most of this was me just kinda doing the same thing over and over, I did still want to stop to talk about the connecting rods. If you recall in the last build, I used a needle bearing to protect the bottom end, which I later found out was maybe not the best idea. But this time, I'm going to use bronze. Thanks to its low friction coefficient, it works remarkably well in cases where there's not much lubrication. But even if they run completely dry, the softer bronze will protect all the important stuff by wearing away first. A little bit like how the sponsor of today's video, NordVPN, protects all my important stuff. With tools like this one, which keep me from clicking on potentially dangerous websites that are either hosting malware or have no data encryption. Which isn't a big deal anyways, as NordVPN's advanced end-to-end encryption means that absolutely nobody can see what I'm up to, not even the people at Nord themselves, as they have a strict policy not to log any of your data. Unlike many of the free VPNs, which are actually just stealing your data and selling it off to people. But NordVPN is much more than just an internet bodyguard, as they have over 7,000 servers across the world. Here's an example. If I connect to a server in Sweden, and then go and look at the price of the Pixel 9, the same phone that I have, the price is nearly $400 more than what it is here. And the best part is, a single subscription lets you cover up to 10 of your devices at the same time. And if you sign up today at nordvpn.com/Camden, you'll receive a huge discount on a 2-year plan, which also includes an additional 4 months on top. And if you're not satisfied, NordVPN has a 30-day money-back guarantee. So if you want to protect yourself online, head on over to nordvpn.com/Camden. Big thanks to NordVPN for sponsoring today's video. Once I was finished up the last few parts, now I can start putting this thing together. And might I say, I'm very happy with how this turned out. Though, I would be much happier if, well, you know, it actually fit. In all fairness, it's not the crankshaft's fault. I would know as I had to spend hours dialing it in. Remember that hole I made earlier? Well, as it turns out, it is in fact not centered. Maybe the block shifted around a little bit, or more likely I just measured it wrong. I don't know. In any case, it could be worse. Because without that one bearing in the middle, now it seems to rotate perfectly fine. But this totally throws a wrench into my plans. These two sides of the engine need to be totally separate from each other, and by removing the literal only thing doing that, then I'll just have to make some kind of a seal that takes its place. Now, trying to make a functional seal on a 3D printer is a little bit difficult, but trying to make one that can block pressurized gas around a rotating shaft is a lot harder. Well, that sucks. It also doesn't help that I already welded the whole thing together, so the only way to get anything onto that shaft is by splitting it in half, which only complicates things further. But after about a good week or so of trial and error, I eventually came to a design that's going to work perfectly. Well, should. Because the only way to know for sure is to make the cylinders. Because both cylinders are made up of small parts, which are also made up of small parts, it meant there was going to be lots of milling, drilling, and welding to get it all done. If you ever wondered why uploads are sometimes so far apart on this channel, this is why. Well, that, and it also really doesn't help when a giant storm passes through and destroys basically everything. Some of the things that I cover in only a few seconds are often hours worth of work, spread out across several days, and this was no exception. However, after many late nights in the garage, both cylinders were finished and ready to go on the engine. Now for the pistons, originally I was just going to use these ones, but then I figured, why not just make a set of my own? And it's not because I may or may not have made the cylinders too big, and consequently now needed bigger pistons. Of course not. And you know, there's actually quite a lot of engineering that goes into a piston, which is just a fancy way of saying there's a lot that can go wrong. But honestly, it wasn't that bad. because after only a couple of hours, now I've got a set of pistons that are going to be perfect. Which is great, because once I had everything I needed for the ignition system, which in this case is just a set of breaker points, all I had to do was add the last finishing touches, and it's done. And I think this is probably the coolest looking thing I have ever made. It's already my favorite.
Wow.
However, what would make this thing so much cooler is if it actually runs. But I guess there's only one way to find out.
Bruh.
I'm not really sure what's happening. It could be a lot of things. So I thought it might do something if I pulled out one of the spark plugs and ran it off just one cylinder, which didn't work. So then I tried the other one, which also didn't work. Which is weird, because every time that I've had to use this stuff, it's always done at least something. But in this case, nothing seems to happen.
Dude.
And I'm starting to think that this crappy intake might be the problem.
The sides of this are like completely porous. Like it feels like a sponge.
Which definitely isn't helping. But even after I gave both cylinders a dedicated carburetor, still, neither of them were showing any signs of life. And it didn't seem to matter what kind of a spark plug I used either, because something is definitely wrong. By this point, I was completely lost. I was sure that I did everything correctly. But then I started to think about that intake again. Piston-ported engines, just like this one, might have a little bit of backdraft that comes from the intake, which is normal. But this is way too much. It almost seems like there's more air coming out of the intake than there is even going in. So I started digging around the intake side, which is when I noticed something strange. If you take a look at the piston skirt, it's supposed to stop here at the roof of the intake, but instead it actually goes way past it, which is weird, because I know that I measured all the ports correctly. So I had a look at the exhaust side, and sure enough, the piston is also too high. I think I see what's going on here, but just to be sure, I used my calipers to measure the piston from where it's supposed to be at top dead center, versus when it's actually at top dead center. And as it turns out, there's about 3.5 millimeters between the two. And it's not just one cylinder either. I checked the other one, and it's also just as bad. Honestly, I have no idea where almost 4 millimeters just disappears to. But in any case, the cylinders are sitting way too low. And as a result, the timing of all of the ports are totally wrong. But I think I've got an idea.
Yeah, that's what good oil looks like.
If the cylinders being too low really is the problem, then theoretically, I should be able to just make a set of spacers that go beneath the cylinders, which would then raise them up to the height that they're supposed to be. And with a new set of intake runners, it seems like the backdraft issue has all but disappeared. However, would just a couple pieces of plastic really be enough to fix this thing? I don't know. You tell me.
That was so cool. Yes!
If you couldn't tell, I was stoked. This thing sounds fantastic. It's exactly what I was hoping for. Well, sorta.
Okay.
It does have a few problems, and I think I see why.
Why is that 0?
Both cylinders suddenly have no compression. Well, until you use copious amounts of oil, which isn't exactly ideal.
Yeah, so there's oil, like, everywhere. Even this thing is covered in oil, and it's, like, way over there.
I couldn't tell you exactly what the problem is, but I'm fairly certain these cylinders are to blame, as the cutting bit ended up leaving these deep grooves all throughout the bore, which I was hoping would have just honed out. I guess buying the absolute cheapest boring kit I could find was maybe not the best idea, but in any case, I am very happy with this thing. I think that with an improved set of cylinders, and this time, an actual exhaust, this thing could be a real treat. So subscribe, and I will do that.